Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to The Order. I am Templar, and today on this video we are actually going to be talking about the arms and armor of the Peasant Soldier. Now, when I say the term of Peasant Soldier, the term of meaning is actually a saying like of serf, or in this case like we would see in the Peasant Revolt. Now, in this case, the Peasant Soldier will technically most of the time be of a Peasant Soldier type class, or as well even also the type of soldier known as the Medieval Archer. Now, if we do understand the medieval archer, for example, they are a version of peasant soldiers that were actually part of the military in this point in time, and the same thing goes for other peasant serf soldiers. Now, what is a medieval serf? A serf is actually a type of, well, peasant, that of which is under the rule of the liege lord, and of which, if you think about it, it's technically the medieval European versions of a version of a slave. But most people don't view it that way. Now, how is the medieval peasant soldier supposed to be? Now, when we think of the medieval peasant soldier, most of the time we think that it's this way and not this way. But in truth, it's actually stated that the peasant soldier can actually have emerged sometime during the time of the Crusades. So why don't we actually get into their armor, shall we? For example, when we take a look at their helmets, most of the time their helmets would actually be the bassinet, kettle helm, and the secret helm. However, sometimes they were known to use the solids by the late medieval period. But that's pretty much very rare to see. But most of the time their most famous helmet would actually be the kettle helm. Why the kettle helm? The kettle helm was so cheap and easy to manufacture, it was technically easy to manufacture compared to other helmets. However, that's stating the fact. But when it comes to the secret helm, of which was before the said kettle helm, it's stated that the secret helm is used mainly prior before the kettle helm was ever created. In fact, the secret helm is technically a, well, dome-like helmet, and of which actually is nicknamed the secret helm is because, well, it's held underneath the male coif, for example. However, peasant soldiers are known to have used it. Now, though, this is actually explaining another version of it. In fact, the bassinet does come out later on in history, but only later on. But that's the thing. The bassinet helm would actually most of the time be an open-faced, visor-less helmet. And in doing so, these helmets had no mail, they had no form of, well, protection other than the type of way it was manufactured. The thing is, most of the time the kettle helm was the main type of peasant soldier helmet. So what does that conclude to? Well, that concludes to the fact of how these type of helmets were manufactured. In doing so, it actually shows the fact that the kettle helm was used in a form mainly used by the medieval peasant army. So we can see why these were used a lot more than the other helmets. However, what about their other forms of armor? Well, that's the thing. The peasant soldiers hardly had that much armor, and it's actually stated the only type of armor they would use most of the time would be the Gambeson. In fact, Gambeson armor, or padded armor, was actually probably the most famous. In fact, it actually stated that peasant soldiers, especially archers and other forms of peasant military, did use forms of gambeson. However, it is stated though that peasant soldiers did not, and I repeat, did not actually take the arms and armor from their said slain opponents. That would go all to the liege lord, not them. So we could see there's a problem about this, and of which most of the time these gambesons, as we think about them, are extremely hard to understand and know to the history of manufacturing. So why was the peasant soldier mostly using the said gambeson rather than just any mail or anything like that? Well, it's kind of obvious. Mail was expensive, the same with plate armor, and so on and so on. Now I hear already. But Templar, where would they get the plate armor? Well, it's actually stated they would get the plate armor, such as the helmet, from their liege lord. However, that's the thing. Their liege lord would technically own them, as I stated before. So, yeah, sometimes these weapons would actually be used this way. So, technically, this armor would just be that. This would just be a gambeson and helmet. Which, if you ask me, is kind of a big disappointment for the peasant soldier. So, yeah. But now here already. But Templar, what about their shield? Did they have any shields? No. In fact, it was a very big rarity to see them even use shields. However, they would sometimes use a buckler shield. However, these were technically small. And most of the time, these would have actually been used by the said medieval archer, not the said other medieval foot soldiers. So, yeah. However, the peasant foot soldier was a lot different compared to the peasant archer. So, how? Well, for one, the peasant archer was actually a lot more different, and sometimes they actually wore boiled leather jerkins over their said Gambeson armor. However, we're still unsure if that was true or not. However, there is a big difference between the medieval archer and including the medieval peasant foot soldier. How so? Well, it's kind of the fact that the main helmets by the late medieval period, the archers started to go for more either the Secret Helm or the bassinet helm, because of the fact that they don't get in the way of the said bowstring. Now let's take a look at their weapons. For example, let's take a look at, say, what was their main weapon? What was their secondary weapon and such? Well, it depended on the foot soldiers and what they were doing. For example, if it was the normal type of foot soldier, say in the regular peasants military, well, here's the thing. The serf soldiers, or serf foot soldiers, would actually most of the time use large pole arms. These would normally be spears, or including to the fact of bill hooks, glaives, war scythes, or scythes themselves, and including sometimes even a two-handed axe, but that was a big rarity. However, their secondary weapon would technically be of a lot different designs. But yeah, let's take a look more deep into it. Now, one weapon that is noticeably famous for them would either be the spear or pike formation, that of which they are famous for, mainly because of the fact they actually use these to stop horse charges. Now, if y'all don't understand how dangerous a horse charge is, here's the thing. Many people during combat, especially from the early years of history, from the very beginning of the Bronze Age and all the way leading up to the said modern wars such as World War I, kept using the so-called volley formation in order not to actually get better accuracy, but to actually stop a said cavalry charge. In fact, if any of y'all play Napoleon Total War, for example, you understand my point, why you had to keep that formation in order to stop a cavalry charge. So yeah, you can see why the pike formation was used. In fact, we could see this at the Battle of Bannockburn, for example, when Robert the Bruce in the process massacred the said English army with pike formations. So yeah. However, if you were to go to, say, Eastern Europe mostly, there would be a weapon known as the war scythe. The war scythe is probably one of the most gruesome weapons that would have been used. However, let's take a look at its Western brother, for example, that would have been the glaive. The glaive was technically a sword that was broken on the battlefield and would be turned into two glaives. For example, the bottom half of the broken sword would be turned into one glaive, the top end would turn into another glaive. However, most of the time these swords would have, or this glaive would have been turned into a, well, single-bladed type weapon. But the thing is, these weapons were still being used. Now, though these weapons, as I stated before, the scythe and the glaive, are incredibly gruesome weapons, of which were incredibly meant for both thrusting and cutting type designs. However, the scary part is, we don't know how dangerous these things were, but you do know one thing, you don't want to get cut by them. However, in Western Europe, a new weapon came around known as the bill hook, or some pronounce it the bill or bill hook, either way it works. In doing so, these weapons were perfect for combat use, mainly because of the fact you could actually hook, thrust, and including you can also do a lot more. For example, if I was, say, in a group of said bill hookmen or pikemen or whatever, and I was the guy with the bill hook, here's the thing. What I would actually do with the bill hook, I would actually use the hooking piece mechanism, or piece, or whatever you want to call it, to actually hook his foot or arm and such. In the process, I would then, well, trip him, or in the process, he could fall down. In doing so, I could then use the said pike piece, or the very tip of the said piece of the bill hook, as a spear to stop, say, a cavalry charge. Now, also, there is this type of hook, or what they call a type of axe piece, or pickaxe, or some people even pronounce it as a pick. I technically call it a pick, but you get my point. And this type of design was actually used to actually, in the process, go through the parts of body armor, such as, say, mail, and probably Gambeson. So yeah, this explains how dangerous it was. In fact, if you were to hit somebody with this, it probably could kill somebody. However, these type of weapons were later on replaced by the halberds. We can see why. But the bill hook was still being used by the English military or English foot soldiers up until the pike formations of the earlier colonial period. But now, what about the other weapons? Now you're already, but Templar, what if in the fact that they have to go from hand-to-hand fighting, and in doing so they have to drop their polearm? Well, in truth, there would be many weapons that the said peasant foot soldier would actually use. This kind of went on from the flail, the two-handed axe, the Cleaver, the Sax, or including even a Warhammer. Now, I hear you already, Templar, that's a little too many. However, here's the thing, most of these weapons actually evolved from the peasant class. For example, the Warhammer was originally a pickaxe, that of which was used by miners, and in doing so, these weapons were incredibly dangerous. In fact, the peasant version Warhammer was mainly used on the battlefield, in which these were technically taken from said groups. However, such other groups of weapons would actually also be the axe or the two-handed axe, of which are sometimes a one- or two-handed version, or a multi-handed version. Now, the multi-handed version is incredibly dangerous because it uses in one hand or in two hands. However, these were incredibly hard to control with said one hand, so they would normally use them for two-handed use or just one for one-handed use. And these axes would not look like these stereotypical, idiotic, double-headed axes. These would actually be a one-headed axe with a hammer on the back end. In doing so, you can actually pretty much use this as a type of said weapon. Now, that actually explains the part about it. In fact, the axe head version of the said weapon could actually be used, well, to cut the human remains. However, the hammerhead version could actually be used on the said metal pieces. Now, why were they made this way? These were made as a utility type piece of weapon. Now, what does that mean? Here's the thing. If you were to be in the medieval period, your utility weapon, like the axe, your utility axe, would actually be manufactured in a type of form. In fact, they would actually be a lot different compared to our modern day versions. For example, when we think of a utility tool like a hammer, it would actually have a hammer head end and it would have a type of back end that would be able to pull out nails. However, in the medieval period, they actually had this version also, but it was attachment with a third piece, which would be an axe. There would be a hammer, an axe blade, and on the axe blade there would sometimes be a little bit of a nail remover. In fact, this was really impressive. In fact, archers especially were actually famous to actually have their own version just like this. However, there another weapon that I can actually pretty much see a peasant soldier most of the time using would be the flail. However, the flail is a really dangerous weapon in medieval period times, mainly because they had different versions. In fact, there's also the one-handed and the two-handed flail, which I know I heard already. Templar, there should only be one-handed flails. Well, that's the thing. The one-handed flail is mainly famous because it was also used by medieval knights. However, the medieval knights used metal balls on the very end, of which this is different compared to the peasant version. In fact, the peasant versions sometimes even had two-handed versions. In fact, the two-handed versions were really gruesome because these also had what you might call a type of weighted system, not just with normal type balls, but sometimes with a piece of wood. For example, let's take a look at these types of pieces of mace heads, or flail heads as they are called. Now, what would the flail heads look like? Well, they would look different compared to what they were used as. For example, sometimes they were just regular chains that were attached to the end of the flail, which most of the time this would have been on a one-handed weapon. However, if it was, say, on a two-handed version, sometimes it would have a massive type of block of wood that would have been studded and such. However, it's still left unknown how it would have looked like, though there are some versions that have an attachment of rope, of which have stones on the very end, which are incredibly dangerous. Now, how is the flail used? Well, if you look in history books, the flail was used to actually separate the wheat from the shaft. In doing so, this was a perfect example of a good weapon. Now, here's the thing though, the two-handed version I would view not mostly used in secondary compared to the said other weapons. However, the one-handed version, yes. Now though, that's the thing. The flail is still a very dangerous weapon used by peasant soldiers. But still to this day though, it's still hard to explain. Now, another type of weapon that we can also look at is the cleaver, or which many of y'all don't understand the difference between a falchion and a cleaver. Here's the thing, a falchion is a type of foot soldier's sword, not a peasant soldier's sword. In fact, a peasant soldier can't actually get his hand on a cleaver. However, a cleaver then turns into the messer. However, the cleaver is a good version because this can actually be a type of weapon that could be manufactured in a form of, well, a said butcher's weapon. However, that's been a big giant, well, I want to say, one-handed type sword. But it's technically not a sword, it's an elongated knife. And in doing so, this elongated knife was incredibly perfect for a said foot soldier. However, most of the time, they didn't have a crossguard. They didn't have any form of protection on them. However, it is stated, though, that peasant soldiers actually loved them, especially. But most of the time, though, they would have used the sax. Now, the sax was another good weapon because the elongated sax was actually incredibly dangerous, and as well is technically an early version of what you might call one-bladed cleaver. In fact, these weapons were made from poor iron. This poor iron, in the process, manufactured into this type of weapon, mainly creating a type of heavy blow design weapon, especially famous by the Vikings or even the Saxons, who were named after this said weapon. Now, one final weapon that a peasant foot soldier would probably wear would also be his dagger slash knife. Now, why? Here's the thing. Everybody back then actually carried a knife or a dagger. In doing so, this actually did not just show that he was a free man, but it did show technically he was also able to work. Now, what do I mean by that? Here's the thing. Everybody back then was actually stated to have actually carried a said blade of any type. In fact, even peasants. Now, why? Here's the thing. How are you going to expect a peasant to do his job if he doesn't have the proper tools? So, in fact, every peasant did have a said weapon. And especially also women. In fact, women were also stated to have actually carried daggers for, well, protection. Especially when it actually came time in history during the peasant revolt, when a said nobleman had actually tried to rape a said miller's daughter, which it did not end well. In fact, it's stated that the nobleman actually got his balls slit open from his lower abdomen to his mouth for his sinful crime. In doing so, his body was then paraded in the street for all to see, which, you gotta admit, he was probably not liked by the people. However, now let's take a look at the medieval archer. Now, what's the massive difference between the medieval archer and the said peasant soldier? Well, one big thing, actually. The peasant soldiers did not have the bow. In fact, the bow was actually mainly famous to be used by peasants. However, mostly those that got really famous from it would actually be none other than England. In fact, England was pretty much the only country by the late medieval period that was still using the longbow, and actually were famous because of the longbow, especially the Welsh. In fact, the Welsh rebellions were mainly famous because of it. Now, as well, I will leave a link down below in the description for y'all if none of y'all know anything about these weapons, and as well, I will also leave links to documentaries on the Welsh rebellion and the peasant revolts. That way y'all can see my point about this, of which you can understand a little bit more about. However, it's actually stated that the Welsh archers were actually so famous that, in fact, they were actually stated to have actually been famous for mainly because none other than the great king known as King Henry of Wales, who actually later on fought in the said Battle of Agincourt, who actually was stated to have actually taken an arrow wound to his face by one of these said weapons. In fact, that's how great this longbow was, and in the process damaged, well, the great face of King Henry. However, it is stated, though, that this type of, well, gear was technically near identical to the same with the armor. However, the weapons were technically also nearly identical. However, it's actually stated the archers did not use the flail nor any form of polearm, but they did use the said knife and dagger combo, because technically that's how they use it. But they were mainly famous for also loving to use the said one-handed axe and the cleaver, mainly because it protected them a lot better. However, they would have also used even also the one-handed flail or the warhammer also. But yeah, these weapons were perfect for them, and as well, it's kind of understandable of why or how the peasant soldiers would have fought, especially with this arms and armor. And of which is kind of why I like to talk about this, because these guys are pretty much forgotten in history. But anyways, guys, hopefully you like this video. Like and subscribe. Also check out more of our videos, and also click that bell button for more notifications, especially when the next upcoming video comes up. And also, guys, please subscribe to the channel, because it also helps out the channel grow, and it also helps out y'all to actually understand history better, and as well hopefully teach our younger generation more about history, because here's the thing, many people don't know anything about the peasant soldier, which is why I wanted to talk about this. Anyways, guys, click that bell button, more notifications. Also check out our Facebook, for that way y'all know when the next video is going to be about, and hopefully I can catch y'all very soon. Anyways, guys, this has been Templar. Have a great day.